In the summer of 1926, Jiang started his northern expedition to defeat the warlords in the north and unite China under one government. It progressed remarkably well. By the next year, KMT had controlled most places in the south of the Yangtze River. Some of the warlords were defeated and ran away, others switched sides and became KMT generals. However, the expedition was halted in 1927 as a political struggle broke out within the KMT. Despite Sun Zhongsan's approval to work with CPC, some rightists in KMT insisted the opposite. They only wanted to defeat the warlords and build a capitalist society like those in the West. They had no interest in socialism and class struggle. In contrast, the leftists in KMT were more friendly to CPC's policies. It was understandable for different people to have different opinions on revolution. The development of a person's view depended on several factors. His immediate social environment was perhaps the biggest factor. In general, people from rich families and with high-profile friends were more likely to be conservative. Those who were from poor families and had suffered a lot were more likely to be revolutionary and aligned with the communist ideas. At the time, the left-leaning members in KMT had Wang Jingwei at the head and established the Wuhan government. CPC advised them to choose Wuhan as the capital because it had many factories and was convenient to launch labor movements as had been done in Russia. In the meantime, the rightists led by Jiang founded the Nanjing government. Both claimed they were the official government of the republic. In his early time, Jiang was left-leaning, but after the death of Sun Zhongshan, he became more and more right-leaning. There were two reasons for his change. First, he was born in Zhejiang, a province close to Shanghai. He had deep connections in Shanghai and was surrounded by friends and supporters who were mostly capitalists and wealthy people. He was heavily influenced by them. Second, he was mindful of CPC's impact on the revolution. To support the Northern Expedition, CPC launched labor movements, funded workers' armed forces and self-governing bodies in Shanghai. The rapid development of these initiatives shocked the rightists in KMT and affected the interests of Jiang's friends. They felt the communists want to take their power and would replace them in the future. They began to make plans to eliminate the communists from the KMT. Both the Nanjing government and the Wuhan government had their own armies. Neither side could prevail the other. We had mentioned previously that Feng Yuxiang was a warlord supportive of Sun's revolution. At the time, Feng had declared to join the KMT government and became the nominal governor of his controlled area in northwestern China. He had the largest troop besides Jiang and Wang. Both the Nanjing government and the Wuhan government wanted to win Feng's alliance. At last, Jiang got Feng's support and the Wuhan government agreed to be incorporated into the Nanjing government. Another reason for Wuhan's decision was their fear for the CPC. They were also concerned about the CPC sharing their power. After all, their political goals were not exactly the same. Jiang's Nanjing government first started the persecution of the communists in Shanghai in April. After its combination with Wang's government, the combined government began to purge CPC members from their territory. The CPC members in the KMT controlled area had to operate undercover since then. To continue working-class struggle and fight back KMT's aggression, CPC organized the Nanchang Uprising under the leadership of Zhou Enlai using the small army it possessed. They successfully took over the Nanchang city and later retreated from it as they were not able to defend it. The Nanchang Uprising marked the failure of the first cooperation between the KMT and the CPC. The uprising occurred on August 1. This date was now the Army Day of China. At the meantime, Mao Zedong was ordered to lead another troop to take over Changsha. But the situation was that CPC's army was too small compared to KMT's. Their plans to take big cities all failed. After his failure in Changsha, Mao commanded his troops to retreat to the Jinggang Mountains, a rural area along the border between Hunan and Jiangxi provinces. He fought guerrilla wars here against the local KMT troops and established a military base. Later, a troop led by Zhu De, which had fought the Nanchang Uprising, came to join Mao in the Jinggang Mountains. They formed the later famous Zhu Mao Red Army. The CPC and the Red Army began to grow up in this mountainous area. On his way to the Jinggang Mountains, Mao reorganized his troops in the Sanwan village in Jiangxi province. A party branch was established in every company of the army, and for all levels above the company, a party representative was appointed. This was the first time the institution of political commissar was set up in the Red Army. It helped strengthen the party's control on the troops and align the soldiers' thinking to the party's ideology and policies. The army from then on became the army of the party rather than that of any individual commander. In the Gutian Conference 2 years later, Mao stressed the importance of building party branches in the Red Army. He said that the Red Army is the military organization that executes revolutionary tasks. It must obey the party's command and wholeheartedly fight for the party's causes, principles, and policies. This institution of political commissar improved the team cohesiveness of the Red Army and increased its combative effectiveness. It distinguished the Red Army from other armies controlled by KMT and the warlords and set the foundation for its future victories. Other armies, in contrast, swore their allegiance to some personal commander and had no political goals to fight for. Their soldiers did not have much ambition and only fight for their personal survival. They were not very willing to sacrifice themselves for victories. As a condition for the combination of the Nanjing and the Wuhan KMT governments, Jiang stepped down as the president, but he still controlled many political and military affairs in private. During his step down, he married Song Meilin. It did not take long for the Nanjing government to find that they could not do much without Jiang's involvement. They let Jiang come back to continue the northern expedition. After several months' preparation, Jiang launched his assault in April 1928 with the help of Feng Yuxiang and Yan Xishan, two of the biggest warlords in the north. Their alliance quickly defeated the other alliance of warlords between Wu Peifu and Sun Chuanfang. Another warlord, Zhang Zuolin, who controlled Beijing, decided to pull out from the old capital and retreated to his northeastern base. However, on his train back, he was murdered by the Japanese using explosives. His son, Zhang Xueliang, knew he could not fight Jiang alone and joined the KMT government. With Zhang's submission, Jiang nominally united China. The aim of the northern expedition was to remove the warlords. The results were that some were defeated, but others converted to become KMT generals. These new generals still effectively controlled the area they had previously occupied. They only nominally submitted to Jiang's central government, and Jiang had nearly no influence on their controlled areas. The four biggest warlords at that time were Li Jongren from the Guangxi clique, Feng Yuxiang from the Zhili clique, Yan Xishan from the Shanxi clique, and Zhang Xueliang from the Fengtian clique. Jiang was aware of this situation and began to set up a plan of disarmament to curb their military powers. This plan was fiercely and unanimously opposed by the warlords. Besides the disarmament, some other conflicts also intensified between Jiang and the local powers. In early 1929, the war between Jiang and Li Jongren broke out. Li was defeated decisively and became a subordinate of Jiang. Then Jiang began the war with Feng Yuxiang. Knowing that he was no match to Jiang, Feng aligned with Yan Xishan to fight Jiang together. The war continued for several months in the Zhongyuan region, and both sides suffered heavy losses. Finally, Jiang's central government won the victory. Wang Jingwei came back from abroad at the end of 1929. He had been in exile after the combination of the Wuhan and Nanjing governments. Under his leadership, the defeated Li, Feng, and Yan quietly formed a new government in Beijing to oppose Jiang's Nanjing government. However, Zhang Xueliang expressed his support for Jiang, and the new Beijing government disbanded. By the end of 1930, except for a few rural areas controlled by the CPC, Jiang effectively controlled the whole China. In May 1931, he declared that ROC entered into the period of political tutelage and passed the temporary constitution. This marked a big success for Jiang, but Sun's revolution was far from realized. The warlords still controlled the local government, albeit they were more submissive to Jiang's order. The foreign powers still had considerable influences in China, both politically and economically. The average people did not find their situation getting any better. The society was dominated by warlords and compradors. China was still a semi-colonial and semi-feudal society. After subordinating the warlords, Jiang became the dictator of China. He had no appetite to continue to pursue Sun Zhongshan's goal of revolution. On September 18 this year, the Japanese staged the Mardin incident and began to invade northeastern China. Jiang had studied in Japan and he knew how intimidating the Japanese forces were. His army was no match. On the other hand, the CPC had grown quickly in the rural areas in the southern China, and significant troops were needed to neutralize them. So Jiang commanded Zhang Xueliang not to fight the Japanese army and retreat to the south. He effectively headed out the whole northeast China to Japan. At the meantime, he amassed large troops to invade the Jiangxi Fujian Soviet, which were discontinued rural territories controlled by the CPC. CPC had set up a state there called the Chinese Soviet Republic, or CSR. From 1930 to early 1933, Jiang had launched 4 encirclement campaigns against the CSR, but all failed in vain. After the Mardin incident, Jiang was widely criticized for his inactivity against the Japanese invasion. His challengers inside the KMT tried to displace him through political and economical means. Jiang fought fiercely back and stabilized the situation. Since the founding of CPC, its headquarters, the Central Bureau, had been in Shanghai. In late April of 1931, Gu Shunzhang was arrested by KMT. He was one of the most senior members in CPC and responsible for the security of the whole organization. Because of the nature of his job, he knew a lot of top secrets and possessed many classified documents. He rebelled against the CPC and provided a lot of information to the KMT. The Central Bureau was exposed and had to relocate to temporary locations. It became harder and harder for the Central Unit to operate in Shanghai in that environment. As a core member of the Central Bureau, Zhou Enlai had been working in Shanghai for many years. After Gu Shunzhang's arrest, he moved to Mao's rural base in December. Other bureau members also followed his step and gradually relocated to the Chinese Soviet Republic by early 1933. However, their relocation caused significant troubles for Mao Zedong. Mao had always been humble and realistic. He knew his Red Army was too small to fight against the KMT openly, so he chose to hide in the mountains and conduct guerrilla warfares. Gradually, he expanded his base to the nearby towns and villages. At the time, CPC was not an independent party. It was heavily influenced by Kuomintang led by the Russian Soviet. It stuck to Russian teachings that were not a good fit to the Chinese reality. Many in the Central Bureau were overseas students from Russia who had no field work experience. Their political and military orders to Mao Zedong had incurred significant losses to Mao's army. For the unity of the party, Mao did not openly oppose their orders, but with the Central Bureau far away in Shanghai, he was able to follow their orders only marginally in execution. By the time the Central Bureau came to the CSR in early 1933, Mao had led 4 counteracts against the Jiang's 4 encirclements and successfully defended the CSR's territories. But after the Central Bureau's relocation to CSR, they took the lead in political and military affairs and left Mao aside without much work. The then General Secretary of the party was Wang Ming, who was only 27 and appointed by Kuomintang. He had studied in Soviet for a long time. After Gu Shunzhang's arrest, he had left Shanghai for Russia to avoid KMT's hunt. The then de facto leader in the Central Bureau was Bogu, who was also a young man favored by Kuomintang. In the later half of 1933, Jiang launched his 5th encirclement campaign against the CSR. This time, the CPC leader Bogu gave up Mao's previous strategies and employed a German military advisor called Otto Braun or Li De as the general commander of the defense. Otto overestimated the Red Army's capacity and employed positional warfare instead of Mao's guerrilla warfare. The result was a heavy loss. After a year's fighting, the CPC began to realize that they could no longer keep their CSR base. They had to start the eventful Long March to retreat to a safer place after of KMT's reaching. After a 3-month march, the Red Army reached Zhunyi and held the famous Zhunyi Conference. At this time, the head count was only half of the number when the Long March started. The whole party began to realize that the political and military agenda in the 5th encirclement were not correct and a great loss was suffered. After analyzing the situation and the previous history, people came to find that when Mao Zedong was in command, the Red Army was invincible. They had enjoyed victory after victory, but after the Central Bureau from Shanghai took the lead, they began to suffer defeat after defeat. So in the Zhunyi Conference, Mao was elected as the de facto leader of the party and the Red Army. Then, under Mao's leadership, the Red Army fought several successful battles against the KMT and got rid of Jiang's encirclement and chasing. It reached northern Shanxi province in October 1935 and based there for more than 10 years. Mao Zedong had never went to a military school or accepted any formal military training. Before arriving in Shanxi, he had not read any military books except for what he learned from ancient Chinese history. Yet, he demonstrated to be a great military commander in the Long March and in the previous military campaigns. We can only conclude that he is a genius. When the Long March began, the Red Army had no clear final destination. Some rough plans were improvised, but later abandoned as the situation changed. After breaking away from KMT and entering into the western mountains of Sichuan province, the Red Army held the Lianghekou Conference, in which they decided to establish a base at the junction of the Shanxi, Gansu, and Sichuan province. When they passed the grasslands and marched to the border along the Shanxi and Gansu provinces, Mao learned from a newspaper that there was a CPC base of considerable size in the northern Shanxi province, established by a Red Army branch. He then decided to move their destination there. The youngest among the CPC leaders who established the northern Shanxi base was Xi Zhongxun, who was the father of Xi Jinping.